I don't see what I did to deserve money just by living here. So I don't think the state should give away the money. But I would spend it if I got my check.
Everybody, it seemed, had an opinion about the Zobel case. Finally, the state Supreme Court announced its opinion. The distribution plan did not violate the Constitution. Alaskans rejoiced as the state prepared to distribute $142 million in dividends. But the Zobels would not concede defeat. They appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The High Court agreed to hear the case. The checks did not go out. For a third and final time, Avram Gross would argue that the state had a legitimate legal reason for favoring long-term residents.
Now, this case raises very difficult questions about the way the state may differentiate among its own citizens in furthering certain communal goals. The state of Alaska has decided that it is best for its population, and its population has decided this through its legislature and its political action, that the best way to deal with this money is to make certain differences between its citizens in the amount they receive any one year, because it's in the best interest of the state that they receive graduated amounts over time.
You don't go to work for a factory, and the day after you go to work, or 30 days later, expect to have the same retirement as him who put 30 years in for the company.
The state of Alaska isn't an oil company that can just hand out money to whoever it wants. It's a state, and it has to, therefore, accord its citizens a certain standard of treatment.
Now, back before the Civil War, people could live in states and not be residents of that state. In fact, they could live in a state and be a slave. But the Civil War and the 14th Amendment ended all that. And it made everyone a full and equal citizen of the state that they live in. And that's the proposition that this lawsuit is all about. We're trying to vindicate that, and that's why we've gone to court.
The Zobels have obviously taken on a very unpopular cause, and they've created a lot of animosity about it. You know, this case has taught me something, and that is that you can disrupt somebody's principles all you want, but don't mess around with the money they're going to receive from the government. That's another matter. That's cold, hard cash. They've gotten a lot of people upset.
I think that the Zobels were more interested in making a name for themselves than the case. But then that's, you know, the motives of somebody is something that there's no way you can look at. They certainly aren't going to win any popularity up here, but then they probably aren't going to be living here.
There's a very strongly held social value in Alaska placed upon how long you've lived here. And unfortunately, Alaskans have carried that into their law. And I think that's the line we cannot tolerate. We cannot have the law treat people differently on the basis of how long they've lived here. And so this lawsuit has been very unpopular, simply because people don't think that Chichakos, that's what new people to Alaska are called, should be challenging statutes like this.
We hit them in the pocketbook, which is a very sensitive area for a lot of people, especially in Alaska. So consequences have been that we have received hate mail, we've received death threats, phone calls at midnight. We ended up having to change our phone number so it's unlisted so that people couldn't find us. As a personal consequence, you begin to change your life, the way in which you react to people. You become, in some ways, afraid of strangers. You don't go places maybe you would have gone before. You end up you want to be anonymous again, which is a strange thing to say, I guess. But at the same time, it's not fun being hated.
As for the Zobels, they feel that there's an anti-newcomer thing. Well, in their case, I'd say they could be here 30 years and they'll be hated by a large segment of the society, regardless.
The majority doesn't decide what individuals' rights are, and the majority doesn't decide what the Constitution means. That's a job for the courts, and that's why we filed the case, and that's why we're going to ask the United States Supreme Court to decide it.
October 7th, 1981. After thousands of hours of preparation and months of waiting, each attorney had 30 minutes to argue his case before the United States Supreme Court. Mark Sandberg began his argument, but soon he was interrupted by questions from the bench. Many of the questions sought to discover just what language in the 14th Amendment supported his contention that the Zobels' rights were being violated. Was it the first sentence, guaranteeing citizenship? Or was it, as Chief Justice Warren Burger suggested, a combination of the first sentence and the last, which guarantees citizens the equal protection of the law. Sandberg answered the questions and completed his argument.
I've been to the United States Supreme Court before, and all I can say is that it's a somewhat awesome experience. You can't help but sit and think about what has come before and the impact this court has had on the United States of America. And there's another feeling. You sit there and you look up at the justices and you realize that this is one of the only institutions in America from which there is literally no appeal. Those 9 persons up there will determine the law for the country, and they will determine it on the basis of the Constitution, which means that it may not be changed by the Congress. They have the final word.
Avram Gross presented the case for Alaska. Quickly, he too was interrupted by a barrage of questions. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wanted to know if the state's program violated a fundamental right to travel. Justice Thurgood Marshall, who feels strongly about the 14th Amendment, was especially persistent in his questioning. He himself had stood before the Supreme Court nearly 30 years earlier to argue one of the most important 14th Amendment cases of the century, in which the court ruled that public school segregation was unconstitutional. Today, he reminded Gross that the 14th Amendment applied equally to all states. Gross was unable to make his initial point before his time expired. The battle was over, but the Supreme Court would not announce its decision for more than 8 months.
I was nervous this morning at breakfast. I was less nervous as we came over here, and when I got here, I realized that this is where I always wanted to be, so there was nothing to do except stand up and talk.
I had hoped that I would have a little longer to get into the explanation of the case, because much of the questioning, I think, could have been forestalled if I'd had the opportunity to lay it out a little more clearly for them. But you always anticipate in front of the Supreme Court that you're going to have one question after another, and that's what we had.
What's being vindicated is not us. The Constitution will be vindicated. I really believe that. Everybody thinks that it's hokey. But it isn't Ron and Penny Zobel being vindicated. It's the Constitution and Equal Protection Clause, which has been threatened by this state statute. Because if Alaska can do it, the rest of the country can do it. Start caste systems based on how long you've lived in the state. The Constitution will be vindicated here.